Next up, just want to run through a scenario here about managing natural resources over many years and the types of information that are generated from that. For this, we'll focus on a scenario from our backyard, and it's a life cycle of a new natural area. To start, we were lucky enough as an organization to receive this donated property in the center of this key riparian zone with an opportunity of restoring historic side channels for salmon habitat. The initial phase is to focus on knitting together key properties around the donated property so that we have a target area where we can make a difference and actually achieve the outcomes we're looking for. Our director gets involved defining the target area and figuring out the acquisition funding picture. Our legal team is involved to pursue the acquisitions and the easement agreements and gather the file cabinets full of supporting documents for that kind of work. Conservation scientists are key to do site visit reports and environmental reviews to understand the viability of the properties we're looking at. From there, we move on to a phase of conservation planning. What are we actually going to do with this property? What's possible and feasible? What kind of threats are on the property? What kind of things do we need to mitigate for? What are some of the planned activities and budgetary requirements that we would have to accomplish that work? And what kind of monitoring and key indicators should be put into place to help us know how we're doing? These are questions, obviously, for our conservation scientists and land managers. Eventually, we move on to long-term management and monitoring. This turns into a management site, and over time, we do many work efforts, perhaps a few each year. For example, interplanting, invasive removal. Also start to do monitoring to understand how things are responding to our activities. Here we get all kinds of folks involved, land technicians, contractors, finance leads, volunteers, etc. Ultimately, at the end, we do need to come up with performance measures about how we're doing. Taking all those pieces of information together that build up over the years, we often come across seeing them spread across many various systems within the organization. And the question that comes up is, how do you keep track of all of this? Not only are there barriers to sharing data between departments because of this, staff turnover often means institutional memory is lost. We also see that leveraging data from prior activities is difficult. And putting together performance performance reports can become time-consuming and inconsistent between reporting periods. Further, this isn't what we want to do for our day jobs. We really want to start to use this data as a strategic asset. And when we start to talk to our M&E folks, what they want to do is make sense of all this information. They want to turn the data into information and start to think of it in a cohesive whole. So if we are taking the action of restoring a floodplain and pursuing that strategy, how does that strategy actually affect the contributing factors and threats that we're seeing on our property? So for example, here is the strategy of restoring floodplain. A contributing factor, a result here is to secure landowner permission for restoration, implementing riparian re-veg and connectivity projects, addresses the threats of sediment dynamics and water temperature, and that results in improved habitat, target of side channels, and ultimately benefiting the Chinook salmon in the population we're targeting. Beyond just building understanding, we want to learn and adapt. So how do we start to learn from this information? One key technique that we've seen, and I know many of you work on every day, is managing performance measures. So given our results chain that's defined earlier, what objectives and goals are we going to track? And how are we going to put together performance measures that indicate how we're doing against those objectives and goals? So for our example here, a performance measure is length of river access allowed by landowners for securing landowner permission and restoration. Another one is area of connected functional habitat and side channels. That's one we can calculate from the acquisitions that we've completed. More complex performance measures that take longer to develop and are outcome oriented, for example, would be number of juvenile out-migrants and females to indicate how we're doing against the goal of reducing fish disease in the lower watershed. So given that scenario, let's talk about some of the theoretical underpinnings here. One of the ones we're very familiar with based on our work with Marathi and the open standards is adaptive management. In adaptive management, information is integrated and used to drive the processes within your program. And it's really about capturing and sharing learnings about your activities to help you inform improvements in future activities. At the core of this is information sharing. So you get to step 5 here, and it's all about capturing and sharing your learning and feeding that back into your next planning cycle. So it's important to understand and recognize the importance of using your data as a strategic asset to help in this cycle. Another framework we're familiar with is structured decision making. I'm sure some of you have come across this and have learned about this, if not used it. This methodology is effective when integrating the perspectives of various and diverse stakeholders. Again, though, we see iterative cycles of learning here, which requires effective use of your data assets. An example of this is the work that we've done here in the Northwest with the Columbia Basin Tributary Habitat Expert Panel. That's a mouthful, but it's a group that takes scientific and local perspectives into account in making decisions in prioritizing habitat restoration work in the Columbia Basin. Interestingly enough, there is the theory here of the knowledge pyramid, which is related to the prior 2 frameworks we just discussed. And this is taking reality, deriving data from it, so through monitoring or through capturing data when doing activities in the field, transforming that into information, generating knowledge from that, and then ultimately making wise decisions from all that work. And I like to talk about this as organizational learning. This is a well-known theory in the information management space, and one that we can leverage in our organizations to improve how we treat data as a strategic asset.